Okay, welcome back to members of 121 Community Church in Grapevine, Texas, and our ongoing study in Jurgen Moltmann and the Evangelical Theology, edited by Chung, published in 2012. We're going to look at essay number 4. We're going to take a look at Burns on Theological Anthropology, and it's going to be a very interesting look at a doctrine of man, very unique to Moltmann. We're going to look at man and God's promise of presence, man and God's act in nothingness, and then a critique in our third moment. Let's go to block 1, and we read that God in creation becomes our text. It is an ecological apocalypse type book. There has been a technological seizure of power over nature in our current history. The 21st century combines 19th century optimism in global progress, but coupled with a negative threat of mass destruction. Now, note 2. Accumulation of power is matched by its continued misuse, says Moltmann. We are addicted to compulsive progress, but we divorce that from any human or humanitarian goals. It's an unchecked lust for power that is fully transparent in our world today. Therefore, note 3, Moltmann says we need to recover the eschatological orientation of theology toward the promise of God's kingdom, by acquiring truth through dialogue with others, where truth becomes illuminated and convincing through that dialogue. And out of this dialogue, we will be called and charged with a mission of life. We will feel compelled to participate in a mission of life. So note 4, eschatological hope has a Christological center for Moltmann. The resurrection represents God's promise of presence in solidarity with the God-forsaken and a godlessness of the world. The cross represents God's embrace of fellow suffering. Key, if you look at note 4D, the real human person is found in the rejected Son of Man and the hope of his resurrection. The real human person is found in that dialectic between cross and resurrection. Now, note 5, as far as Moltmann's methodology, eschatological hope in the indwelling God of all reality is our starting point. Traditional language must now forge brand new concepts in a new symbolic way of formulating God's future kingdom. Symbol of an eschatological nature comes to the forefront, and it's moving toward new creation in God, within the very being of God. Creation is moving forward within the very being of God. Humanity and human identity is moving forward within the very being of God. New creation is in God. So note 6, we take up an integrating way of thought, a fully comprehensive way of thought. We perceive in order to participate in mutual relation. Time is focused toward the future. Creation must be interpreted through the lens of eschatological future. So we have an interpretive lens for our method in note 7. Space is the space of God's presence. It's an interpenetrated space. History is the divine history. It is not just nature, it is nature united with the sacred. It's a divine history. And it has an anthropological side to it. It is where we find the identity for the self. So let's take a look at block 1, note 8. the anthropological side to divine history. The relationship between nature and the self must be without stress, without strain. Irene peace represents that relationship. It is the healing of fragmentation. It comes about through the indwelling of the Spirit in the soul and in the body of the self. So the indwelling of the Spirit, the doctrine of creation is not divided from the doctrine of man. Anthropology is acquired through the passageway of Trinitarian cosmology, by way of incarnation Christology. Dialectical reconciliation is taking place between the cross and the resurrection through an eschatological Trinitarian cosmology. So we look at this dialectical reconciliation within which we define human identity. It is a mistake to posit transcendent creation wholly distinguished from, I should say it is a mistake to posit a transcendent creator wholly distinguished from his created natural cosmos, with humanity as dominating over nature. God is Lord over the cosmos in an interpenetrating Trinitarian way. Humanity must be Lord over nature in the same manner, by participating in and by being taken up in that ontological Trinity. So it's an anthropology and lordship. Note 11. The Spirit is creating a future of universal Sabbath community. We must participate in its communitarian indwelling. In creation, God acts inwardly before acting outwardly, contracting himself, zensum, to make room for creation within himself, to create a nothingness space for creation to take place. That's a key point for understanding that kenosis is the very essential nature of God. In the beginning, there is all God. God has to actually create within himself because life cannot exist outside of God. God is life. Creation must exist inside of God's being. So God in the beginning contracts himself to create a nothingness space within which creation can take place within the being of God. That's that zensum concept. But what it points out is that kenosis is the very nature of a loving God. God the Father is kenotic in his very first moment of the precondition for creation. Now let's move on to block 2. Now in block 2 we want to take a look at this real true self going out of itself, and we look at God's act in nothingness. Block 2, note 1, the nothingness space for creation within God. God's act of self-humiliating creative love is the beginning of God's kenotic relationship with the world, which equals mysterion of the Messiah. Through his vicarious suffering, redemption of humanity is achieved. Creation is God's act in nothingness. It begins with that created nothingness space within which creation can take place. So creation is God's act in nothingness. Note 2, creation. God creates the world by letting it become within himself. The cross. Through the cross of the Son, God becomes omnipresent by gathering this nothingness into his very being. Resurrection. Then the resurrection becomes the beginning of the kingdom of glory. Therefore, here's our radical conclusion. Creatio ex nihilo means eschatological creation with the promise of justification. It's creation, it's kenotic creation and promised justification. And that's a very key term. Block 2, note 3, creatio ex nihilo. That's huge for Moltmann. I'm glad that the author Burns brought this out, because that's a key concept for Moltmann, creatio ex nihilo. the Creator is faithful toward life on earth, we must negate the concept of cause, strict cause with regard to creation. Instead, creation is understood as the cosmic community between spirit and cosmos. And that unfolds as an ontological trinity. So let's take a look at this note 4. The ontological trinity. The Father is the overflowing love. The Son is the creating and redeeming love. The Spirit is the omnipresent love of redemption. A pneumatological doctrine of creation. The Spirit equals the transforming agent of creation as the indwelling influence of the whole. The work of God exists as a presence of Spirit. That is how God works in creation, as presence of Spirit. So note 5. Pneumatology converges in the symbolism of creation as indwelling doxa glory, moving toward eternal heaven and earth, the future sabbatical community where God will be all in all. Sabbatical community. This is pan-theistic theology. God in the world and the world in God. God manifests himself through the world's being. The Spirit secures this holistic cohesion and its symbolic structure. Spirit is a movement from dunamis, potentiality, to energy, actuality. Note 7. The Spirit is the quintessential point of self-organization. The self's inner and outer symbiotic relationships. Selves are bound together socially and culturally within a spiritual ecosystem. There is the inner relationship of redemptive spirit and the outer relationship of cosmic spirit. So note 8, we're looking at cosmic spirit and redemptive spirit. They come together in the fellowship of love. Personal self-transcendence must go out of itself in participation in the social and divine realms, in the divine history. Creation is a dynamic web of interconnected processes. Communitarian equality must replace anthropological domination. So we conclude with the self going out of itself in communitarian equality. Note 9. The self can only understand itself within community. The Klesis call from history is leading the self to future of kingdom. The real is interpreted through the lens of the crucified Messiah. Image of God comes through relationship to God within the whole of existence. It's a Trinitarian and cosmological gaining of identity and gaining of image of God. So we get, in these first two moments, we get Moltmann's presentation of a doctrine of man. And I think that Burns has done an excellent job here. And he did bring out creatio ex nihilo, which I appreciate. What he wants to do next is we're going to go to block 3, and he's going to critique this doctrine of man that Moltmann has given in blocks 1 and 2. So block 3 shall be our critique. Okay, block 3. Moltmann's image of God dismisses the distinctiveness of humanity set apart from other living things. He does not maintain the distinction between natural and revealed theology. His panentheism is not biblically precise. His view of creation and the concept of Zinsum is not a biblical concept. View of creation, he bypasses traditional discussions of the nature of the human person. Image of God becomes a social likeness. There is no foregiven individual self. The history of God overrides this distinction. The human condition defines the self, not the being of the self. Human condition and being. Man is introduced into the mutual interpenetrations of the Trinity. True humanity is only expressed in terms of panentheistic spirit. The self's imperative is to become and embrace a self-transcendence in the divine Trinitarian relation. Where is the emphasis on human finitude? It seems to be missing. Self-transcendence and finitude. Moltmann becomes very close to slipping into pantheism with his God as all in all. He counters by positing the personhood of the Holy Spirit. The Godhead is to be understood in their perichoretic relationships. Sin, in this context, equals selves who isolate themselves in godlessness, creating and annihilating nothingness against creation. The concept of sin. God absorbs alienation into himself to overcome it through the God-forsakenness of Christ on the cross. Sin begins with Cain slaying Abel. Genesis 3 is perceived as mythological interpretation. Biblical atonement becomes God's solidarity. And that is exactly what Moltmann says. Biblical atonement becomes God's solidarity with inhumane humanity. That radically differs from the evangelical perspective. I want to say before I give my summary, my analytical summary, I want to say that Burns has done an excellent job of presenting this doctrine of man in Moltmann. It's not easy to track. You have to really dig into multiple sources, and he did that. You have to dig into God and creation. You have to dig into theology of hope and the crucified God, of course. He did that. He did a good job of doing that. So he has dug into multiple sources, and I think he's put together an accurate and responsible evaluation of Moltmann's doctrine of man. And his critique from the evangelical perspective, I think, is additionally accurate. So I can't really cite anything against this essay. It's a very good essay. But I want to give a final synopsis and evaluation. And I'm going to develop the triad this way. It's going to be block 1, the real human person. Block 2, the movement of inner and outer symbiotic relationships. And block 3, real self plus outgoing self-transcendence equals the eschatological individual self. So, block 1, the real human person. Identity is found in the rejected Son of Man and his resurrection as the relational self in peace with nature. The self is defined within Trinitarian cosmology. Self is acquired through communitarian indwelling. Evaluation. For Moltmann, the self is defined as existing in a hope and lamenting body state within the sighing community. I'm going to read that again. The self is defined as existing in a hope and lamenting body state within the overall sigh of community. Now, block 2, the movement of inner and outer symbiotic relationships. The self evolves through a spiritual ecosystem, participating in both redemptive spirit and cosmic spirit, abbreviated under the concept of fellowship of love. Personal self-transcendence goes out of itself and participates in the historical divine realm. Those are all properly presented and evaluated by Burns. Image of God is realized through community relation. I agree with that completely. Now, block 3. So what's the conclusion? Real self and outgoing self-transcendence come together in Moltmann's eschatological individual self. Unlike evangelical theology, there's no foregiven individual self. Self is defined within the context of panentheistic spirit. Atonement becomes equated with God's solidarity with inhumane humanity. And I say that is exactly what has to be recognized. Moltmann's doctrine of man is the doctrine of the eschatological individual self, who reaches self-transcendence and then goes out of itself in participation in the historical divine realm, and then through that dialectical mission, return moments continue to refine the real human person. That's what has to be understood with Moltmann's doctrine of man. Moltmann posits an eschatological individual self. That is his doctrine of man. It is the self that reaches the self-transcendence of self through Jesus Christ, and then goes out of the self in historical participation in God's divine history. Then, through return moment, the self will continue to refine the concept of real human person. And that's going to be, I think, the conclusion to an excellent, excellent fourth essay. I can only say good things about this essay and about the book so far. That's going to wrap up pages 69 to 104. We're going to pick up next time in essay number 5.